Potholer54 and other climate alarmists are in habit of attaching a lot of papers with their videos, which they say are proof of climate change. Like evolutionists, these people search these papers not based on the fact that they have read these papers, but based on keywords. Potholer54 would often point out that all of this that he is presenting is not his theory. He does that so as to escape the consequences of putting his weight behind these theories. It is very easy to present one side of the data and then argue that you are a neutral party and your putting of weight behind the data is not based on your understanding whether the data or the theory is correct, but whether just that it exists. As such, you are absolved from the consequences of hosting a particular type of information on your channel because you are not responsible for it. Potholer54 often claims that it is actually something that is better, and he cites the fact that this could be viewed as better because he's just talking about the scientific view. But Potholer54 does not show the contradiction between various models of science, and as such, what he presents as the scientific view is basically his selective view of what is the case, because not all scientists agree with his view. This is the reason why he has to develop the idea of consensus, in which he assumes that there is a particular set of scientists who agree to a particular set of papers, and these scientists represent the state of science at that time, and every other scientist is put out of the field. This one such case is observed where Potholer54 has cited a paper and given special importance to that paper. This paper is titled Positive Feedback Between Global Warming and Atmospheric CO2 Concentration Inferred from Past Climate Change. And it was published in Geophysical Research Letters in 2006. This is the video of Potholer where he cites this paper. It has 3 authors. Now, if you read this paper, if you have a chance to read this paper and not believe Potholer on his words, you will find that this paper contains some interesting statements. Now, whatever I will show here would be the statements contained in the paper, and you can check the paper for yourself. I will post certain sections of the paper and tell you how this modeling was done. Now, remember that this modeling is what Potholer54 bases his whole idea, his whole science, and whole channel on. So this is important. So in this paper, the authors are trying to do 2 things. Firstly, they are trying to study the effect of CO2 on temperature, and then the effect of temperature on amount of CO2. By doing those 2 things, they are trying to calculate how this feedback system, which they assume to exist on Earth, works. So here they state a simple logarithmic increase of global temperature with concentration of, for example, CO2 is usually assumed. Now, this statement is very interesting because it shows that this model does not prove that global temperature are affected by CO2, but it is something that it assumes. So earlier, this relationship has been put forward in some paper, and this paper basically just assumes this relationship and works from there. So how can Potholer54 show this model as an evidence of global warming or as an evidence of temperature being affected by CO2 when such is assumed in this paper? Now, there may be a paper in which this relationship is actually calculated, but Potholer54 should show that paper because this paper does nothing except of assuming an actual causal relationship that is argued to exist and then deriving equations from that. So this paper's validity to serve as an evidence of climate change or global warming is only as much as the effect of cart on pushing the horse. In fact, because this paper is assuming what it is intended to prove, it just begs the question when put in the light of when put as an evidence of climate change or global warming. So here the authors basically refer to another paper and assume that the global temperature is affected by the concentration of CO2. Now, this is not the only problem with using this paper as citation. Let's go to the next step. Now, in this para, the authors are saying the basic rationale is that pre-industrial CO2 variations during glacial cycles and the little ice age have been largely temperature driven. So basically, they are trying to find the second part of the equation as to how the temperature affects CO2. To find that out, they have to assume that the pre-industrial CO2 variations were dependent on temperature changes, and they don't have any causal relationship to establish that. The equation that they derive is derived empirically by observing the pattern which the graphs show. So causality is not established in this paper. It is assumed that CO2 is affected by temperature and mostly temperature alone. And in this case, no other factor which may affect the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere during pre-industrial times is taken into account except of temperature. Let's move further and look at another statement that the authors make. The authors say, if we interpret the correlation between pre-industrial CO2 and temperature as representing the effect of temperature on equilibrium atmospheric CO2 concentrations, we can combine the two equations. So basically, now they have both the parts of the puzzle. Firstly, they have found out the effect of CO2 on temperature, and now they can also find out the effect of temperature on CO2. To study that, they had to assume that the correlation between CO2 and temperature was the effect of temperature on CO2. So they had to assume causality from correlation. This is the most interesting part of this study because it basically commits a fallacy. A correlation does not imply causation. In fact, one can establish any type of correlation as causation in a similar manner in which this study does and give a theory which sounds a little bit reasonable. We've all heard the jokes about the pirates and the rise in temperature and the amount of pirates, decrease in the amount of pirates, or the rise in ice cream sales and rise in murders, or something like that. Correlation and causation are not the same thing, but the study has to assume that. And remember, because the study assumes that, the study cannot prove that. Otherwise, the study would be begging the question. The goal of the study is quite different than what Potholer54 makes us believe. And we'll find that out from the mouth of the authors, from the writing of the author themselves. Let's move on to another statement. So the authors here say, if we assume that the CO2 equilibrium as a function of temperature remained largely unaltered in the absence of anthropogenic emissions, the reconstructed covariation of ancient CO2 with temperature may be interpreted as revealing the slope of the effect of temperature on CO2 equilibrium concentrations. Now they are trying to find the parameters of the equation. For that, they have to find constants. To find those constants, they have to assume that CO2 equilibrium as a function of temperature remained largely unaltered. So, in the pre-industrial times, or in the times when men were not responsible for a large emission of CO2 into the atmosphere, the ancient CO2's variation with the temperature is believed to represent the actual causality, and this gives the slope of the effect of temperature on CO2 equilibrium concentrations. This statement does not include any other factor which may have caused a change in temperature or a change in CO2. Any of those things. It just sees the pattern which it finds in a graph during a particular age, takes it and says that this is something that is also applicable now, even though the conditions have changed a lot from the pre-industrial times. This is also very strange. Now, but all of this has been done to just form a model. And this model is in no way a smoking gun because it is dependent on a lot of assumptions. Let's move on to another statement. So here the authors agree that the results differ depending on the particular temperature reconstruction and the CO2 data used. So the slope that they are calculating can vary based on the temperature reconstruction method that they use and the CO2 data that is used. There is also something important to keep in mind. Now, here the author would give a gist of the paper or the conclusions of their paper in a sort of short way. So they say, admittedly, our approach is rather crude as we base our estimation on time series showing the lumped effects of all slow and fast mechanisms. So all through this paper, the people assume that the pattern that was shown by the graph is actually the real pattern. But that pattern that is shown in the graph may involve both the slow mechanisms and the fast mechanisms. Whenever we are acting on time series, all the people who are involved in statistics know that we have to take different effects, short term effects and the long term effects, separately. We cannot take them together because those effects may have different frequencies, those effects may have different effect on the coefficient or the constant, and those effects may have different causal reasonings behind them. But none of that is taken into consideration. It's just assumed that the pattern that we are seeing in the graph represents actual causality, and the slow and the fast mechanisms can be put together and collaborated into a single effect or a single mechanism. Now, we will also see authors accepting one more thing. This is where they point out what is the goal of the study. The main merit of our approach, the authors say, as we see it, is that it allows for an estimate of the potential boost in global warming by century scale feedbacks, which is quite independent from that provided by a coupled CO2 climate models, by coupled CO2 climate models that explicitly simulate a suite of mechanisms. So basically, they are trying to form an alternate model. There are other climate models that exist, CO2 climate models, and they are trying to formulate a model that is different from those models. The very fact that they are trying to find a model that is different shows the fact that they do not believe in the validity of earlier models. So there is a debate that is going on, but Potholer54 does not show you this debate. He just shows you a paper he believes is valuable for his claim to pass into the mainstream as an acceptable scientific discourse. And this is the problem with these studies. He does not accept the debate between this guy and the other guy that is taking place. What he is just saying that there is a consensus. This consensus, as we have already seen, would differ based on the technique used, based on the assumptions used, and based on the data used. The data may be, for some, the data may be of a particular age. For some, it may vary over thousands of years. For some, it may reflect completely another time period. The authors give the gist of their study and importance of their study. They say that the benefit of this study is that it is another study which points to the fact that we might see a considerable boost of global warming and greenhouse gas levels compared to recent trends. This is very important to understand. What the authors are doing here is just one thing. They are developing an alternative model. They are using that alternative model to argue, and they've already assumed the temperature affects CO2 and CO2 affects temperature. They're using that alternative model to basically provide another confirmation of the idea that such feedback exists, but that is based on different assumptions. The extent of the feedback varies based on the model that you use and is not same across all papers. But they believe that, and they say, as Levins once phrased it, one is more likely to accept something as a truth when it emerges as an intersection of independent lies. What it means is that there are different people who are posting different studies, and those studies are not perfectly valid and have different problems. Now, when a study emerges as an intersection of all of those different studies, it is generally more reliable. It may be the case that such is true, but because the study already assumes that the temperature affects CO2 and CO2 affects temperature, it is not an evidence for global warming or climate change. It just gives a model. It just gives a way to represent that mathematically. And different mathematical models are possible based on the reasoning adopted. This is the problem with all of these uh, climate science evidence. So they build on a previous research, which may be flawed, keep on extending it, and keep on citing to previous researches as their basis. But when someone tries to argue for a particular uh, phenomena, They show all of these researches as independent researches. But these researches are not independent researches. And the validity of one research lies on the validity of the researches that it uses to make its own case. Such is the case with this paper. But that is what is often hidden from the paper.